Thank you so much for coming to our webinar. We have, so we're just gonna wait a little bit longer, for about like 3 to 4 minutes before we start. Meanwhile, I'd like to see who's out there. There's lots of people who are guests, and thank you very much for coming into it. The few people from Ocean Nexus, thanks a lot for making your time. Okay, let's wait a little bit longer until we hit, oh yeah, we're hitting 23. So let's go when it's 25. Is that okay for everyone? Great. And then whenever I say something like that, then yeah, it's usually, oh yeah, that's really good. Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everyone to come. This is Ocean Nexus webinar series. Ocean Nexus is a network of the scholars who contribute or devote their research to ocean equity. In ocean equity, we define as social justice in the sea. So this is a platform we can speak about racialization, coloniality, and gender-based discrimination, which sometimes not really welcome discussion in ocean governance and marine conservations, but we believe this is the core issues, and this is something we really need to address if you're going to speak about equity or even sustainability. So I'm so delighted to have my very good friend and alumni of Ocean Nexus Fellowship, Dr. Bodwitch, Hekia Bodwitch now. She is assistant professor, University of Alaska Fairbanks. You can introduce herself. And also her colleague, Dr. Courtney Carothers. Courtney and I met very long time, but I have known her work. So it's just wonderful to have you both in this webinar. Thank you very much. And then I also have Craig Kaviak Chythlook. Good enough? Chythlook. I'm so sorry. I just learned it, So thank you very much, Craig. I heard you are the superstar of regional fisheries governance and fighting against power imbalance and sometimes injustice. Now you have executive director positions. So I really appreciate you being and speaking to us about it. So I'm going to pass it to three of you. And if you could just briefly introduce who you are, because I know you so well. I don't know, where to start. So it would be better if you could speak to you about yourself, if that's okay. By the way, I'm Yoshitaka Ota. I'm a director of Ocean Nexus, and I'm also professor at Marine Affairs in University of Rhode Island. Okay, so I'll pass it to you, Courtney, Hekia, Craig. Please take it away.
Sure, I'll go first. I'm Hekia Bodwitch. I'm at the University of Alaska Southeast, actually. So I'm in Juneau. And my background involves work with Indigenous fishery development issues in New Zealand, where my mom is from. I've also done some work in the Atlantic Canada region. I was a postdoc, an Ocean Nexus postdoc with Megan Bailey. And I joined the University of Alaska Southeast almost 2 years ago, and I've since been working on understanding what's going on in fisheries management in Alaska, especially in regards to efforts to advance Indigenous governance in that space. I grew up in upstate New York, and I'm adjusting to winters in Juneau.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be invited. Thank you so much, Dr. Ota, for the invitation. I'm Courtney Carothers. I'm joining from Degayakuk, or Anchorage, Alaska, the homelands of the Dena'ina peoples, and want to acknowledge their long-term and ongoing stewardship of these lands. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I went to school at the University of Washington and studied anthropology, but it's really been, I think, a shift and pivot in my career to be really trying to help advance tribal stewardship and tribal governance and tribal sovereignty in our research and governance spaces here in Alaska. So do that work in collaboration as an ally. I think we'll speak a little bit about that in our talk today. But yeah, really honored to be here talking about equity in Alaska's fisheries. And we'll pass to Craig.
Yeah. Hi, and thank you again for the invitation. Great enunciation of the last name. Really appreciate it. My name is Craig. My Yupik name is Kaviak, and my family and I all grew up in Southwest Alaska, Bristol Bay. We're Yupik and have been in that neck of the woods for quite a long time. My journey with the wonderful panelists here started back in 2017, getting back into school at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which led me down multiple roads, but one of the main ones being the Tamamta Program that Courtney Carothers is co-PI on. But the background in fisheries and thinking about just fisheries governance in general, my family and I have been involved with the subsistence and commercial fisheries and all activities out there in Southwest Alaska. Both of my parents spent almost 3 decades working for the state and the feds, supporting a lot of the regional subsistence data gathering, the coordination of advisory committee meetings, and just a lot of that, creating a lot of those opportunities for tribal governance to engage within the state and federal processes. And my real fond memories of sitting in meeting rooms and hotels and doing a lot of travel with my parents has kind of really helped groom me into my current position as new executive director for the Yukon River and Tribal Fish Commission, where I started this role in November of this last year. But prior to that, just doing more fisheries gov work, participating in the North Pacific and Board of Fish processes. So really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, 3 of you. Today, the format is I'm going to ask you 3 to present your presentation. You take each of the turns, and it's about like 20, 25, 30 minutes, as long as you like to go. And after that, we're going to have a discussion, but it's more about like I'm asking questions, but I probably don't even need to ask questions to speak about this very, very important issue. And as Japanese, I have to acknowledge, some of the stuff happening in Alaska is caused by my nations and our consumption. So it's a bit, something needs to be spoken about even at Ocean Nexus widely. So the advancing equity through Indigenous governance, fisheries in Alaska. Thank you very much for being here again. And please take it away, Courtney, Craig, and Hekia.
Thank you, Yoshi. I'm going to start and then I'll pass it on to Courtney and Craig. So I started working in Alaska at a time when state and federal fishery management bodies were formalizing processes for engaging traditional knowledge in decision making. And Alaska is the US's largest state by far, and it is home to over 229 federally recognized tribal nations who represent communities with over 14,000 years of experience stewarding fisheries and who continue to have extremely strong relationships with fish today. Many of these communities are located off road systems where food bought from stores is prohibitively expensive, and fish and other wild foods are essential for subsistence and other forms of well-being. Despite a long history of fishery management practices and relationships with fish that continue today, Alaska state and U.S. federal bodies control much of the fishery management that happens in Alaska. These bodies include the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, which is one of 8 fishery management councils in the U.S., and the council directs management actions for waters 3 to 200 nautical miles from shore, and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, which directs management for waters 3 nautical miles from shore and inland, and the management of inland fisheries, except inland fisheries that cross federal lands and fisheries within the state's only Native Reserve, Metlakatla in the southeast. So over the last several years, state and federal management actions have been increasingly questioned as fisheries have collapsed, including important salmon runs that inland communities along rivers rely heavily on for subsistence and well-being. As certain fisheries have declined, state and federal management entities have adopted processes for considering traditional knowledge alongside Western science in decision-making. And I've been working with this team of students, including, among others, Alex Jenkins from the Tamamta Program, and received advice from Craig and Courtney to understand the extent to which these policy directives to consider traditional knowledge have corresponded to changes in management actions and processes. The studies involved interviews with policymakers, Alaska Native knowledge holders, and others who participated in management processes about their experiences. And I'll kind of give a vignette here about some of those experiences to give a little bit of a lay of the land of what's happening in fisheries management in Alaska, and then pass it on. So in talking with folks who participated in these processes, widespread understanding that policymakers' exposure to and understanding of traditional knowledge has increased, but that management outcomes have yet to align with what traditional knowledge bearers suggest is needed. And we see these dynamics in recent discussions around how bycatch of chum salmon that is caught by the pollock fishery in the pollock trawl fishery in the Bering Sea should be managed. So the North Pacific Fishery Management Council has heard testimony from communities located inland in Western Alaska about the depleted state of fish stocks. Fisheries have collapsed to communities along the Yukon River, and where Craig works, and he will likely talk about this further, are no longer able to fish. And the pollock trawl fleet catches fish that are otherwise bound for Western Alaskan rivers as bycatch. And the council was charged with making a decision on how to manage or address that issue. Over the past several years, the council has heard, I mean, really decades probably, hundreds and hundreds of testimonies from Alaska Native knowledge holders and council members in deliberating about what their final action should be, referenced the influential role that these testimonies have played on their decision making. Council members are talking about how we used to think in tons, and listening to Alaska Native knowledge bearers, we now know that 4 fish can provide the needs for a potlatch. But the final decision that was reached by the council was far short of what many hoped was going to be achieved. It set a cap on bycatch for Western Alaska chum at 45,000, and that is similar to the past 10-year average of catches, so it's unlikely that that cap will be met. So what's going on? Why do we see hundreds and hundreds of testimonies not corresponding to change? So there's 3 kind of types of policy issues that folks who participated in these processes have highlighted as constraining. And a way to kind of think about these constraints and these policy issues is that these are all things that might need to be tweaked a little bit to see alternative outcomes. So policies governing a decision-making authority. Traditional knowledge bearers lack representation in council processes and Board of Fish processes as well. And policymakers lack qualifications to evaluate traditional knowledge. So as this individual who's on the advisory council or the science advisory council for the SSC for the council says, we're so embedded in the Western science part of things. We hear the stories and acknowledge the pain and the suffering, but we don't have a foundation to connect that to what the council is doing. Mismatches also persist between how traditional knowledge is typically shared in the public testimony format. Traditional knowledge is often shared over boats, on land, and not in meeting rooms. And traditional knowledge holders need to be able to fish to evaluate fisheries, and there's been restrictions on Alaska Native communities' ability to harvest due to caps on or restrictions on subsistence harvest, but also licensing programs that have resulted in the transfer of wealth and licenses for commercial takeaway from communities. So where do we go here? I think one of the things that I've been really struck by in talking to people who've participated in these processes, Alaska Native knowledge holders and others, is the commitment to continuing to show up to these meetings. There's this understanding that legislative action will be needed to ultimately secure changes. This idea that we need a bolt decision for Alaska is referenced periodically in discussions around fishery equity in Alaska. But in the meantime, to get to that point, we'll probably need support and efforts to build shared understanding of fishery needs are part of that process. Within this call, is there a thing or like a call to action, to so to speak, for scientists as well? Scientists are asking Indigenous folks to increasingly participate in their research. And here we've heard that from Alaska Native individuals, it wouldn't be the worst case thing if scientists also showed up to these policymaking spaces and testified and shared their experiences as well. We've also heard that individuals who can speak both worlds, the policy space and the traditional knowledge space, are incredibly influential to policymakers' understanding of fishery dynamics. And the Tamamta program, which Courtney will talk about now, is been referenced as instrumental in helping facilitate that understanding. So I'll pass it on to you, Courtney.
Thanks so much, Hekia. Yeah, it's a real honor to be able to join you all today to speak about this program. It's really dear to the hearts of many of us. So Tamamta is a Yupik and Sugpiaq word that means all of us. And we really came together around this issue of equity. And it was really nice to look through some of the Ocean Nexus materials and really find a shared synergy there with this core foundational focus on equity. So the next slide, Hekia has been sharing a little bit about this, but in Alaska, we face enormous inequities. As she mentioned, there's 229 sovereign tribal governments who really have very little control over the fisheries for whom they have stewarded for 10 plus thousands of years. As a non-native person in Alaska, it was very shocking to me to learn that Indigenous people are still criminalized by the state and federal government for practicing their own ways of life in their own homelands. And that's been a huge part of learning for me. And I think it's part of this shared work that we'll all do together if we really want to center governance equity in our fisheries. But we came together. Doctors Jessica Black and Dr. Charlene Stern are both Gwich'in scholars and leaders at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. We partnered with myself and Peter Wesley, who's a fisheries scientist at UAF, to stand up this program called Tamamta. It started as an NSF, National Science Foundation, commitment to pretty radically transforming graduate education. And so we said we shouldn't be at a university in Indigenous homelands teaching only Western science. We need to very much uplift, recognize, and center Indigenous knowledge systems and how we teach about fish. And also, when we do our research, we shouldn't be doing research as scientists detached from community and place. We should be working with tribes as sovereign entities. We should be working with experts, in community and how we do research. And also, we wanted to start, lighting this fire for big system change in terms of the governance. We very much uplift tribes as sovereigns who should have control over the governance of their fisheries. And so we came together with sort of, massive proposal to change a lot of things in Alaska fisheries. And we submitted it to NSF and felt like shot in the dark, but our reviews, I think once you learn this history and the current system, one that Craig is living and Hekia and I are studying, the reviews were like, this isn't work that should be funded, it's work that must be funded. And so that to me was also important, that our United States Science Foundation recognizes this is an issue of science as well. And so it's really exciting. I think the next slide will provide a short 3-minute clip where you'll get to hear some of our fellows speaking about this program. So it's just 3 minutes, and thank you for indulging this. Hekia, you have to unmute. Sorry, if you could start again and then unmute yourself, then it'll play. Sorry about that.
Indigenous peoples have been sustainably and equitably stewarding fisheries in Alaska for tens of thousands of years. Deep knowledge and governance systems developed over millennia help guide these respectful Indigenous relationships and ways of life. Over only the last few generations has Indigenous stewardship been disrupted by federal and state management systems that prioritize industrial extraction for outside profits, that view fish as commodities rather than kin, and silence Indigenous voices and connections to place. From the outside, Alaska fisheries are widely praised as among the best managed in the world, and yet deep inequities, structural racism, and Indigenous erasure persist.
These Western management systems have failed the fish and the people. Stock collapses from cod to crab to salmon are evident across the state, and Indigenous peoples continue to be criminalized in our own homelands for living our traditional way of life.
Driven by these injustices, scientists and Indigenous leaders came together to develop a program to transform fisheries education, research, and governance in Alaska. The program, housed at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, is called Tamamta, a Supiaq and Yupik word meaning all of us.
Through the creation of the Tamamta logo and painting, Yupik artist Apayak Moore brilliantly represented how Indigenous knowledge systems embody deep meaning, including aspects of connections with land, spirit, and all relations. Tamamta strives to provide a comprehensive graduate program to Indigenous and allied students that will become the next generation of scientists and managers in STEM fields of fisheries, marine sciences, and beyond. We uplift graduate fellows who center Western sciences, Indigenous sciences, and bridge knowledge systems in their work. Innovative courses and research experiences, elder mentors, cultural immersions, and all program elements engage decolonizing and indigenizing approaches to help transform fisheries systems in Alaska.
Tamamta is one of the National Science Foundation's research traineeships focused on innovative graduate education in the United States. It is an increasingly recognized model for post-secondary education that uplifts and centers Indigenous knowledge systems in relational and respectful ways.
Tamamta is all of us.
Tamamta is all of us.
Tamamta is all of us.
That's what it means, it's all of us. We're all doing this together.
Thanks so much, Hekia, for sharing that. And yeah, just wanted to say shortly a little bit about our program. I'm going to pass to Craig to share shortly, but we do have a lot of, I think foundations for a kind of transformative approach. We're writing up a couple papers that we hope to publish soon, but we really do center kind of relationality in all of our work. We center holistic mentorship. We have a really different kind of approach to classwork. We have elders in our classrooms. We've been doing a lot of deep work as faculty, especially allied faculty who may not understand and have to come through a process of learning about some of these inequities. And that's been, I think, a really important part of this. The next slide will show we've been, as part of this, this work is not superficial. It actually is deep, and it involves sharing lived experiences across our different positionalities in vulnerable ways. And we've been able to cultivate a space largely being trained by Indigenous leaders to host these hard conversations in productive ways and in real ways. We started this work, a decade ago, and you can see there was a lot of fear and kind of unwillingness to discuss kind of what we were even trying to get at. And I think we've moved a long way from that. This is a look at a recent meeting at the American Fisheries Society, where we set up a very small circle because we figured we'd have a few folks want to talk about race and fisheries. And the room was full. We had to make this enormous circle, and people were really hungry to progress this conversation forward. And it really does take all of us in this work to get there. So we hope you'll all lean in and join us in this work. The next slide is I think my last one, oh no, sorry, our lovely fellows. So Craig is one of our fellows in cohort 3. We have 3 cohorts of fellows all coming into our program as leaders doing amazing work, and they're getting their graduate degrees alongside running their tribal fisheries, alongside being executive directors, alongside, you know, working at the feds. They're doing amazing work, and so we want to just honor them all as this sort of mutual co-learning system that we've set up. We as well, on the next slide, have an amazing set of Indigenous advisors who are also completely amazing humans leading all kinds of change in their communities, in the nation, in the world, and just want to acknowledge them. I believe I saw Brooke signing on to this webinar, so thank you to her and everyone that's really helped uplift this program and catalyze the change that we're speaking about. The next slide just briefly talks about our impact. And I think the main source of ambassadors for our program are our fellows. We've had 5 graduates so far. And we've been able to, again, the sort of bringing and thinking differently about expertise, bringing elders. We were able to bring 8 elders to an American Fisheries Society meeting in Honolulu. You see them pictured there on the right. That was transformational, to be in a space with such amazing leaders and knowledge bearers, and hearing them give direction for our profession of what we should be focusing on, how we should be doing our work. And then Jonathan Samuelson, another close advisor and colleague to all of us, talked about, you know, Tamamta is sort of seeing this change in action. So just giving him an acknowledgement. And then lastly, I wanted to share, again, as I mentioned, I'm positioned as a non-native faculty member in my fisheries department, and I'm a social scientist and potentially more motivated to think about some of these issues because I have close friends and research that shows me these inequities are paramount and really affecting well-being and everything. But the faculty that have leaned into this work, oceanographers, folks who never really would have to engage in this work if they didn't want to, once they come into Tamamta, they are forever changed by it. A majority of our faculty now support equity as a key goal in our graduate program, in our research and our governance. They didn't when we started. It was probably me and maybe Peter, I'd rope him in, but that was it. They were doing the science in their lab or you know, in their field, quote unquote, field site. There's also been a significant shift in our faculty. When we started this program, our faculty, the majority believed the fisheries in Alaska were well managed and they're fairly managed. Now we have a majority of faculty thinking they are not well managed because they're not fairly managed. You cannot have well managed fisheries if they're excluding, you know, half the state. So anyway, I hope I've given you some of our excitement around this program, but the best, I think, spokesperson probably is going to be Craig. I think I have a last slide here just giving an acknowledgement to NSF and a large body of partners, as well as Hekia's acknowledgement for the work that she presented on. But we're really, Masicho Guyana for letting us share some of these slides. And I think for Craig's sharing, he will just speak without slides. And again, want to acknowledge Craig. Craig, I should also acknowledge I'm a co-advisor to you in your graduate program, but I've learned much more from you than you have from me, I'm sure of it. And I always hate to make requests of your time because you're an executive director. You're doing a million things like on the ground. People need you and your expertise. But Hekia and I didn't want to have this conversation without inviting your perspective. So I'm really want to honor your time for joining us kind of, you know, when you have a million other things on your plate, and really just honor you as a thought leader. And we're so happy that you're able to share today as well.
Yeah, thank you. I will initially take a moment to honestly recognize some of your closing comments. I don't necessarily believe that the thoughts and rationales are mine or mine alone. I'm very cognizant that we have Brooke Woods here, former chair, a massive leader in this fisheries governance and tribal governance work, who's also a fish commissioner. So I'm the work that I have done and the education that I've received, and just have the privilege of stewarding and carrying forward is a reflection of the tribes and the tribal leadership that we've had up to this point. So yeah, thank you. I didn't have an opportunity to provide a bunch of or to create slides. the Yukon River and Tribal Fish Commission, we just held our annual meeting at the beginning of May, and we're deep in the weeds of getting the report outs, following up with action items, and developing and creating the information that is needed to get out to our tribes, so that our tribes can continue to be engaged and be equitably informed. Communication is such a important role as far as the complexity of process and the inequity of Western governance, and leaning into procedurally how much time and energy and effort. I think the term of death by 1,000 cuts is very appropriate when we're having any sort of discussions about differences of opinion in fisheries governance. Is just the crazy amount of capacity and energy and funding that's needed to make sure that our tribes have an equitable seat at the table and can make sovereign and governing decisions on their own. And that's the main hope and priority of the Yukon River and Tribal Fish Commission and many of our organizations that spend quite a bit of time in this role. But I just have some background information about who the Yukon River and Tribal Fish Commission is, some of our goals, and thinking about the prompts and the questions for this discussion, kind of some reflections about some contemporary issues and how we're looking forward to getting through and moving the needle, as people say, in regards to this fisheries governance work. But the Yukon River and Tribal Fish Commission is composed of now 45. We had a new signatory at the annual meeting sign on and adopt our constitution through resolution. Our main missions are to protect the health and well-being of our people, our future generations, and represent all Alaskans and Canadians who rely on the health of our salmon. This work started quite a while ago, and originally the Yukon River and Tribal Fish Commission was a program of Canada Chiefs Conference, and we became our own 501c3 standalone organization in March of this last year. The purpose of our commission, stated in our constitution, is to act as a unified voice for the conservation and restoration of all Yukon River fisheries, protect our traditional ways of life and well-being, establish a comprehensive management plan and program based on distinct customary and traditional Indigenous knowledges and practices. And very relevant to these discussions is striving for co-management to ensure meaningful and substantial tribal and First Nation participation in all aspects of our own self-defined stewardship. And based on our constitution priorities that are outlined from the tribes through resolution, is we are a new organization. We're building up our infrastructure and our ability to enforce or to support our governance. So we're definitely in the rebuilding phase of the organization, and developing intertribal cooperation agreements with state and federal agencies to think about co-management. And then really the big focus right now, post this last regulatory cycle that Dr. Hekia had gave a really good summary on, there's a significant need to unify the voices and the tribes and the representation within the Yukon watershed, so that as we think about collaborative management, co-management, and self-gov, there's just so much internal work that needs to happen to really meaningfully engage and kind of assert that tribal perspective or that tribal governance and how stewardship should happen within the watershed. And I really appreciated the summary, thinking about inequities in decision-making, and just wanted to highlight some current and contemporary issues. Main one being, it's a grounding force of Tamamta. It's why the Yukon River, these resource commissions were made as a way to really build up the tribe's ability of self-governance and focus on our equity and decision-making. There's a relatively long history of inequity and in Western governance decision-making as we transition from true tribal governance and stewardship with very unique, distinct, and well-functioned forms of governance throughout the watersheds of Alaska that manage and maintained stewardship, the relationality, the love that we have for place and for each other for millennia, was all changed in essentially overnight to a bottom line state and federal constitution and a series of laws that were created outside of tribal governance. So addressing those inequity issues through building up our opportunities for representation. I'm really, really appreciative of so much of the work that has been done within this room already. All of the opportunities to build up our representation, to grow from within, so that we can get our Native people into decision-making spaces like the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. We're supporting Eva Dawn Burke, who is a tribal member of Nenana and who has been absolutely killing it in the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council advisory panel body, making recommendations on final outcomes and motions in that space. And then also from Nenana, just recently, and again, like another student of UAF tribal governance, partners with Courtney Carothers, Carrie Stevens, and a handful of other folks that were really kind of the initial catalysts of a lot of these organizations and opportunities is Olivia Hinahi Irwin, who this last year was appointed as a board member, one of 7 board members in the state process, making and creating those regulatory decisions in the state managed fisheries. So, and then finally, one of the biggest issues that we're continuing to deal with is contemporary, but it's been going on for, you know, a relatively long time or short time, depending on your perspective, is the intentional division created by Western governance. So all of these artificially created borders of 3 miles, of 3 miles to 200 miles, of navigable waters, of state constitutions, of Magnuson-Stevenson Act. Essentially, this transition of true tribal governance that created the abundance of these resources for millennia to transitioning and shifting over to the only source of real analysis and metrics of success are the bottom line of like how much money that we're making and how to continue to incorporate and grow in that route. So I think those are some of, I mean, the list can go on, but those are just a few of the ones that I really wanted to highlight. And I think how it's working and playing out in active real time as recent examples outside of the North Pacific and Board of Fisheries, and why this work, it has been and continues to be really important, is the tribes on the Yukon are dealing with significant inequity issues, exclusive bilateral agreements with the state of Alaska and the Canadian First Nations regarding the 7-year agreement or moratorium on Chinook. So there's been management decisions that were under the control of the state and feds that I don't know, intentionally is not the right word, but that assessment of uncertainty has led to the outcomes likely inevitable where we're at today, that has created a significant amount of scarcity. And thinking about how do we address that without getting into litigation, there was a 7-year agreement between Alaska, the state of Alaska, and the First Nations of Canada that put severe moratorium restrictions on the tribes in the Yukon and our abilities to live our traditional ways of life through subsistence and having and continuing and maintaining that spiritual relationship that we have with Chinook. There's been significant discussions about overregulation within the watersheds, not just on the Yukon, but throughout the state of Alaska. The lack of representation, misinterpretation of regulations and law that has prioritized the over extraction or overuse of the commodity as a financial resource versus the tribal perspective of having this very long-standing spiritual relationship and full of reciprocity and significantly different metrics of success. And finally, again, I just really want to continue to highlight how much energy and time and money and coordination and focus that it takes to deal with these issues to make meaningful impacts in the regulatory world. And I'll just reiterate and highlight some of the big meetings that happened in February. So the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council is a governing body under NOAA NIMS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, that deals with all federally managed fisheries 30 miles to 200 miles, the EEE zone. So anytime we hear about bycatch or Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, or a lot of the Gulf of Alaska fisheries, those are generally managed and talked about as far as the regulatory work in the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. I see Doug and Emily on here. Just again, thank you all for being here and participating and continue to engage. The initial agenda item started in the early 2020s. There was a significant lack of chum salmon making it back to their natal streams, and it initiated a NEPA analysis that looked at a range of reasonable alternatives. But again, my frustration with this work is that we are continuing to focus on narrowing the scope, number one, and focusing on inequitable solutions. The main purpose and need statement was focusing on how do we minimize bycatch in the North Pacific, versus a more equitable and representative question would be, how do we get more fish to our smoke racks? How do we feed our families? How do we maintain cultural continuity and create and maintain those opportunities for Brooke to catch fish and for her to have that beautiful life with her kids? That's the most important question that needs to be answered, and why I'm really thankful that all of us are here. And the same thing with the state level, how the state of Alaska manage their fisheries 3 miles and in is generally through limiting access. It's the limited entry programs, and there's a big state managed fishery down in the South Peninsula, commonly referred to as Area M. It's a 98% intercept fishery that catches fish bound for Bristol Bay, coastal Western Alaska. So thinking about Bristol Bay, Kuskokwim, Norton Sound, and kind of every place in between. This is the historical fishery that's been going on for a while. And my interpretations as Craig the Fisher dudes who grew up in Bristol Bay, this has always been a contentious agenda item because of that percentage of intercept versus the, what do you call that? Terminal fisheries like Bristol Bay or other limited entry fisheries where we're catching our own salmon, not somebody else's fish. I will close with, we make quote unquote meaningful impacts by creating the opportunities, by building the relationships in these regulatory spaces, by doing the homework, by reading the technical data, by providing our own visions of analysis and engagement, and other really, really amazing examples of co-management, co-stewardship that kind of goes above and beyond the board system or the North Pacific system is looking at the Kuskokwim River Tribal Fish Commission and their co-management, co-stewardship agreement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife at the lower Kuskokwim there. So it moves us away from showing up at these regulatory bodies, death by 1,000 cuts, only offering advice that does not have to be seriously taken into consideration. And generally, our expert analysis, our elders who are offering up our brilliance of Indigenous knowledge doesn't seriously have to be taken into consideration because of our state constitution or interpretations of the national standards around practicability, equality, bottom line through optimum yield or otherwise. So just really excited to continue the work here in the Yukon, to engage at this level here, and really looking forward to spending more and more time within the watershed to start understanding what our own vision of analysis is to make those meaningful co-management decisions and recommendations. So I hope that is helpful as far as how we think about equity and decision making, and the different governing bodies, and kind of a reflection on differences of opinion on how we get to a management decision. Looking at the state and feds, as Courtney had mentioned, was often considered as a gold standard, but it's, in my opinion and our tribe's opinion, it's really difficult to conserve and manage when there's a dollar value associated with that resource. And when you incorporate it, it's really tough to I don't want to make as much money this year. We've got all this aging infrastructure that needs 1,000 gallons of diesel every single day. So thank you again. Apologize that I didn't have time to create slides, but hopefully adding some context about some thoughts and rationales about some contemporary issues that the tribes are facing, and really looking forward to more discussion.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Craig. And if you could just unmute yourself, because I'm just going to ask a question and you can jump on. My understanding is quite simple. So there's a ban of subsistence fisheries in Yukon for the indigenous communities. And at the same time, industrial pollock fisheries are allowed to catch about 45,000 chook salmon and as a bycatch. So there's just complete imbalance of the logic between you ban here, but you allow them to catch it. And to me, it's not really like a scientific matter. It's just very simple logic. If the crisis is so severe, why do you still allow them to catch so much? So people surely aware of this illogical issues, but how everybody's taking it. And Craig and Courtney and Hekia, what are the counter argument about this and how people dealing with this issue right now?
I'm so sorry. My internet cut out halfway through your question, but I think it was dealing with some of the inequities in the management of the fisheries, and how we're allowed, how Magnuson-Stevens Act essentially allows the intercept of fishery, fish bound for smoke racks versus what's happening in real time in the Yukon.
Yeah, it's completely double standard. I mean, usually we see it, but is it really a double standard, or is it double standard protected by Magnuson-Stevens Act for just the profit of a very powerful, 500 million industry? Is that what it is, Greg?
Well, how I can definitely tactfully answer this. So if we think about Chinook or chum,
right,
as they enter the mouth of the Yukon and make their way to the Canadian border, thinking about that 7-year agreement with Canada, there's about, depending on interpretations, 30 to 70 regulations on the people that interact and engage with that resource, or that, our relations with chum and Chinook on their way through our traditional homelands, through our, that create and maintain our opportunity to feed ourselves and live our traditional ways of life. There's less than a dozen on my understanding of how the federal fleet engages with and manages. I could be wrong, but there's a significant lack of equity and consistency and decision making in the interpretation. And so that practicability standard, everything is only up to the point of practicability. Yes, the bottom line, we have to maintain aging infrastructure. We have to maintain 90 or 60 to 70% of all income leaving the state of Alaska to Oregon, to Washington, to other people that are not literally not even of this state, that are severely impacting our abilities to use personal use, to commercial fish, to live our traditional and subsistent ways of life. So yeah, it's a big inequity.
I mean, I see in some ways, when I hear the title of all of us of your program, it reminds me kind of like the opposite of it, which is some of us. And this is also the title of Heather McGhee, who actually argues the entire American policy failure is because people kind of couldn't get what they want. Universal healthcare, the free education, they couldn't get this because they didn't want others to have it. And then that's what's called the sum of us. It's a history of racialization of the public policy in the United States. So when I heard all of us, exactly it. That's it. If you are not interested in equity, you would not achieve whatever sustainability. That's basically the argument, Courtney, you are making it. In your kind of like a assessment, to what extent we can really translate this very strong message through both education, not to the youth coming from tribe, because everybody knows it, but for the scientists. And, Craig, you have to communicate this to some extent to the scientists. I mean, would you, is it better for us to really push the equal amount of the information for the science, or shall we just really introduce the values that you hold, to those people and make them accountable? I think it's a little hard topic, but if you can just educate us a little bit, I mean, that'd be really great for any of you, really.
Well, I don't know if it directly aligns with this prompt, but something that's coming to my mind, because we do work a lot with scientists, I think there is an awakening and an epiphany about science. I think many scientists go into the study of fisheries or anything else with a sense of science is good, or at a bare minimum, like not bad, right? We're gathering knowledge, we're managing these fisheries, whatever we're doing. And they come to understand the history, like the colonial history, for example, right, in Alaska, where it's not in 1959 that we start having a management of fisheries. We have, thousands of years of governing fisheries that's not taught, not thought is relevant for that. And so I think the work that we can do, I think, to educate people both on the values, but actually just on empirical reality. Like if you want the best data on fisheries in Alaska, that's Indigenous Knowledge. That's the best time series. You don't even have to do the epistemological or ontological shift if you want. It's just that we have empirical data. So I do think there's some utility in trying to kind of educate around context. And like you said, from the outside, and again, I don't study the trawl fishery. I don't really know all the ins and outs. There's a lot of nuance to the conversation. But when you look at a system, you have, until very, very recently, there was no limit on the amount of chum salmon that the pollock fishery could catch. No limit. They caught 700,000 fish one year. No limit at all. And then you have these incredibly important culturally, like you can't overstate how important the cultural relationship to salmon are for the tribes of the Yukon or the Kuskokwim. They're not allowed to harvest a single fish for that cultural need, for that food. It makes no sense, right? When you're talking about an equity thing and you get in the weeds, well, there's all these, Asian hatchery salmon, and that's what they're really catching. And it's just these small percentages, but the small percentages of these enormous, this is $1 billion fishery. So I'm just saying, if you just look at it like this huge inequity, I think something, needs to give. And I love the way Craig framed this as the question we should be asking isn't how do we get this bycatch down? It's why don't we have people on the Yukon River with any salmon right now? What are we should be doing everything in our power to solve that crisis yesterday and certainly right now. That's so important. And I love how you framed it, Craig, because it's so important.
Yeah, great, Hekia. I mean, Hekia, you have seen this inequity in New Zealand, the other side of the Canada, in many places, and now you're seeing it same in Alaska. This just pattern of coloniality, in my mind, it's just everywhere. But it's really difficult for the community to get out from it, because of the interest converge, because they have to manage with their own relationship. Hekia, how do you see this case in Alaska is really as specific as it is, but it's also something we actually see in any other places.
I think a key part of the challenge, and I can think specifically about the issue around trawl bycatch with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council and their actions related to trawling. I think a key challenge is that people who are on the council are also receiving income. They're employed in different ways by groups that receive money from the trawl fishery. So these include community development quota groups that are often primarily Alaska Native groups along the Bering Sea that own pollock quota. And so there's, complications in terms of what the effects of shutting down the pollock trawl fishery would be on these communities. But there's also complications in that we're asking policymakers who are employed in part by these entities to make decisions that would actually hurt their employers. And when you have that sort of structural challenge or political incentive to maintain the status quo that these decision makers have, you're unlikely to see change. So in order to tweak those politics and those dynamics, you need to have increased representation of Indigenous groups on the council, and tribal seats have been floated as an idea multiple times by multiple politicians over the years. But I think what's important to, at least for my thinking, is that it's not just about getting a couple more tribal seats, because those tribal seats won't be majority decision-making groups, right? It won't, unless there's 11 voting members, so unless we have 6 tribal seats, which is highly unlikely to happen, we also need to be convincing those who are part of, or who are representing other entities and involved in other, sorts of activities, of the kind of different types of ways we might think about managing a resource, and think about more creatively how we can interpret the prompts and the requirements that Magnuson-Stevens directs council members to adhere to. How can we think about optimum yield in different ways?
Thank you, Hekia. Craig, I want to ask last question, if that's okay. It's always appeared to me, historically and also currently, they create inequality. It's not even inequity. And then they create the governance system, which is quite not equitable. I'm not even using the word inequitable. It's just not equitable. Don't really give the people who doesn't have a seat and everything to just reflect their voices at all. And then they actually call justice and trying to bring people in their own terms. That whole system appeared to me, somehow embedded in this current conversation of co-management. So, it's just putting so much burden on the community, and then asking community to speak not in their own terms, and then they have to just regulate themselves and they have to work on it for their own land. And he thinks they actually do have a sovereignty. I mean, this is, to me, it's completely crazy, and people will actually agree with it. But Craig, what does really community actually need right now? If there's a bunch of the people who participate in this, but who's going to look at this on the YouTube, really wanting to hear both scientists, social scientists, and what can we do? And it's a bit difficult, but if you can just give us a hint about it, that'd be great.
Yeah. To answer everybody's question, unity and collective understanding, I think, is really important. I love Tamamta, that approach, the utilization of Indigenous knowledge, principles, values, and integrating it with Western science. And then, so we've got the data portions. We need that. We're never going to get away from some form of Western governance and involvement in any of these resource management spaces. Our interactions with science and data will always need to be there. But no, I'm really hopeful and optimistic about approaching these agenda items and issues from the tribe's own perspective and recognition of how we got to where we are in the first place. And it's from a different position, a different rationale, and a blending and an equitable marriage of both. So you're right. It is very frustrating, and it does take a significant amount of time and energy and effort and money, to be quite honest. And we have to balance a million different plates at the same time. But you know, how I would summarize a lot of this stuff and some of the quotes that I've been like, the tribes are constantly being asked, how can your Indigenous knowledge prevent or address this problem that literally I created as a stakeholder and user in this governing body? And just how irresponsible, unjust, inequitable, and frustrating consistently having to educate and deal with. So again, like I'm really, this is why unification, leading with love, and building that collective understanding is so important. Even if we're thinking about practicability and the national standards, we all need to understand how procedurally harvest control rules, fisheries management plans, how to actively engage and come to consensus on how does Craig or how do the tribes work with Jamie Goen and the Alaska Crabbers and Linda Benke and the Longline Association and with Brian Ritchie and so we're never going to get away from engaging on multiple levels of governance. But it's coming to a collective understanding and community education around different ways of knowing and thinking and blending a lot of these issues and concerns in a very solid, manageable, conservative way into perpetuity. And how we're actively doing that now is unifying the voices within the watershed, or attempting to, and building up our own self-governance, so that when we think about collaborative management and how do we physically operationalize decision making, it's from the tribal perspective. It's not reflective of the national standards or the state constitution, but it's truly led by our Indigenous principles and values and our understanding of
you
ecology.
guys are doing it for all of us, you know. Yeah. It's not you guys doing it for you, but it's doing it for all of us. That we got to understand that. Sometimes we just kind of like forget about it, but you know. So I just want to thank you so much, you know, Craig. Thank you so much, Courtney. Brilliant, thanks. And Hekia, great to see you. Thank you so much. This is just wonderful. So hoping to have this conversation continues. And thanks a lot, everybody who've been participated. And if you have a chance, please let the people to know this will exist as a YouTube and people can watch it. And what we like to do is amplify this voice and let's really share the views. And thank you very much for doing this research, education, and work for all of us. Thanks a lot.